much for joining us for George S. Boutwell, the most consequential American political figure you've never heard of. That's my title. All right, so historian Jeffrey Boutwell will discuss his new biography, Boutwell, Radical Republican and Champion of Democracy. George S. Boutwell is the most consequential American political figure you've never heard of. During his career from 1839 to 1905, he was governor of Massachusetts, served in the U.S. House and Senate, was Treasury Secretary for Ulysses Grant, and Commissioner of Internal Revenue for Abraham Lincoln. He helped create the Republican Party in the 1850s and challenged the efforts of Presidents McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt to annex the Philippines in 1900 following the Spanish-American War. In addition to all that, he was instrumental in framing the 14th and 15th Amendments, initiating the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and investigating white vigilante violence against blacks in Mississippi in the 1870s. For 7 decades, George Boutwell sought to redeem America's promise through radical equality, economic equity, and the humane use of American power abroad. Okay, so with all that said, all 120 of us, look at that, who are watching live, and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeffrey Boutwell for joining us here this evening. And Jeffrey, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Great, Robert. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your August evening with me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. My book came out in January. I've probably given 30 or 40 book talks since then, both in person and virtual and Zoom. It's safe to say that this one's going to be a bit special because this one is locally rooted in central Massachusetts. I'm going to take a bit extra time, more than I usually do, to talk about George's connections to various towns in central Mass, from Lowell to Groton to Shirley to Lunenburg to Worcester, all of which played very important parts in his both personal and political life. So for that reason alone, it's really exciting, and it's wonderful to be able to be talking to you. I don't know exactly where you are, but I imagine you're tuning in from Tewksbury and Lowell and Groton and Lunenburg, Shirley, Pepperell, Townsend, and further west. So with that being said, my talk is entitled George Boutwell, Hiding in Plain Sight. And the reason I entitled it that is that, as Robert said, I believe George is one of the most consequential political figures that you and other Americans have never heard of. The reason I say that are starting off two main reasons. One, the length of his career, 1839 to 1905. Consider that over 66 years in public life, George Boutwell was actively involved in all facets of American life through the 1840s, through the Civil War and Reconstruction, up to the 1890s, through the Spanish-American War, and after. In 1839, George met his very first president, Martin Van Buren, on a trip to Washington, D.C. He came face to face with his very final president in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt, on the grounds of the Groton School in Groton, Massachusetts. It was prize day at Groton School. Teddy's 2 sons were going to the elite school in Groton School. George Boutwell, as Groton's most famous resident, having lived there for 70 years, was invited to participate in the prize day activities at the Groton School. And he and Teddy Roosevelt walked for a little bit and talked on the beautiful grounds of Groton School. But his first president, Martin Van Buren, in 1839, his final president, Teddy Roosevelt, in 1904. Through that entire stretch, he was actively involved in American public life. Now, even more than just meeting presidents, George interacted consequentially and significantly with some of our most important presidents. Two in particular, Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, as Robert mentioned. George was a close political ally of both Lincoln and Grant, and in the relationship with Grant, he actually became a close personal friend, as did his family. I'll get to that a little bit later, but George was an indispensable political ally to both Lincoln and Grant during the Civil War and Reconstruction. As a manager of the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, George was one of the most implacable foes of President Johnson in the late 1860s. Johnson was seeking to block black freedoms in the South, seeking to block congressional Reconstruction. And as a member of the Joint Committee on Reconstruction with people like Thaddeus Stevens and others, George led the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1866, 67, and 68. So a very, very important relationship between Boutwell and Johnson in the 60s. And then again, as we've mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt, when Roosevelt was leading America's objectives of annexing the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, George was asked, if you can imagine, at the age of 80 years old in 1898. George is 80. He's, still vigorous and still active. He's writing regular column for the Boston Globe. He's still pursuing his law career. But prominent Americans come to George in 1898 and ask him to be the president of the Anti-Imperialist League. People like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams of Hull House, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and members of the black community. George was the president of that disparate anti-war, anti-imperialist coalition that sought to block America's military occupation of the Philippines following the Spanish-American War. We'll get into that a bit later as well. So length of career and the depth of the relationships that he had with some of our most important presidents. Secondly, George's wide range of experience and expertise. I would venture that very few American political figures, whether they were active for 10, 20, or 40 or 50 years, had as much deep experience in what I consider to be the three major areas of American public life. One, domestic policy and civil rights. That would include constitutional law. George was incredibly well-versed in those issues. He was more than something of an intellectual sponge. From an early age in his teens, he just read widely on everything he could get his hands on, very much like Abraham Lincoln in that respect, but became an acknowledged expert in domestic policy, civil rights legislation, the 14th and 15th Amendments, and constitutional law during his career. Secondly, economic policy and finance. Well, people who are expert in civil rights or constitutional law usually aren't equally expert in the ins and outs of economic policy and finance, but George Boutwell definitely was. Beginning with his tenure as the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in the 1850s, George was well-versed in budgetary issues, finance issues, but then that increased when he was asked by Abraham Lincoln in 1862 to become our country's first commissioner of internal revenue. Congress had just passed an important tax act to raise money for the Union effort in the Civil War. George headed up that office. He essentially grew it from nothing in 1862 to raising millions, hundreds of millions of dollars for Union troops during the remainder of the Civil War. That then led to his being asked by Ulysses Grant in 1869 to become Secretary of the Treasury. And George served there for 4 years at a crucial time in the aftermath of the Civil War. Inflation is running rampant, as it usually does following wartime in America. George had to bring inflation under control. He had to soak up the greenbacks that were circulating throughout the country, while also establishing America's credit with its trading partners overseas. So for 4 years under Grant, he was working day and night to put America on a sound economic footing. So that was his experience in economic policy and finance. Finally, the third area, foreign affairs. Again, if someone's an economic policy specialist, they're usually not an international law specialist as well. But here again, George was, beginning in the 1870s and 80s. He served on a number of important international commissions appointed there by various presidents. He was hired in 1885 by the Kingdom of Hawaii to represent its interests before Congress, recognizing his congressional savvy and congressional expertise. But then that all came to a head, of course, in 1898, 1900, when he was asked to become head of the Anti-Imperialist League and led the fight against America's annexation of the Philippines. So those three, areas of American public life, George was equally well versed in all three of them, and his career over 65 years was devoted to those three areas of American public life. Well, how did he get to that stage? How did he become who he became? George was born in 1818 in Brookline, Massachusetts. His father was a farmer. He managed a farm, didn't yet own his own farm, managed a farm for a wealthy landowner in Brookline, Mass. For those who know where the country club of Brookline is, George actually was born in a farmhouse that today is the modern clubhouse of the Country Club of Brookline. If you go there, which I was lucky enough to do, you can go into the basement of the clubhouse of the Country Club and see the very foundation walls that were underneath the farmhouse that George was born in 1818. Well, the family only lived there for a couple of years. George's father, Sewell Boutwell, was able to raise enough money to buy a family farm in Lunenburg, about 120 acres in Lunenburg with wonderful views of Mount Wachusett. And George lived there from 1820 to 1835. His kind of seminal, important growing up years on the family farm. He learned how to graft fruit trees at an early age. He helped his father on the farm. He would go to school, a common school, but only when the farming chores were done. In the early 1830s, he was apprenticed to a dry goods store in Lunenburg, not Groton yet, but Lunenburg, where he got some experience as a storekeeper in about 1833-34. And that led to a position in Groton, Mass. in 1835. George answered an ad in a Lowell newspaper, moved from Lunenburg to Groton, got a room over the store, and would work long hours, 10 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night in the dry goods store. But he also began to read law with lawyers in Groton, Mass., of whom there were several prominent ones. And so he would do as much reading as he could, especially after hours. When the shop closed at 10 o'clock, George would get his books out, read until midnight or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning. If he felt himself drowsing off, he would throw cold water on his head and get another hour of reading in. Again, very similar to Lincoln in Indiana and Illinois. Self-taught, self-educated, self-read, learning the law on his own. Well, in some ways, moving to Groton was the most important decision George ever made. He's only, 17, 18 years old, but he's getting business experience in the dry goods store. He's getting legal experience working with local lawyers, and he also starts to enter politics. He runs for school board in 1838, 1839, and in 1839, he also makes his very first trip to Washington, D.C. with a local Groton lawyer. That's where he meets Martin Van Buren. But also, just as importantly, he has his first direct experience with slavery. Groton at the time in the 1830s was a very progressive town. There was an active anti-slavery society there that George would have attended and learned about the issue that was then beginning to tear America apart. But his first visceral experience with slavery was 1839, when he was out walking in Washington, D.C. on a Sunday morning by where the National Mall is today, and he goes by something called the Yellow House. It was a slave pen where slaves were bought and sold and then also held before being sent downriver from D.C., Virginia, to even harsher conditions in Louisiana and Mississippi. George meets an elderly black woman standing outside the slave pen who is inconsolable. She's crying. Her daughter's been taken from the family, is about to leave for Louisiana the next morning. And George will never forget the absolute anguish on this woman's face and in her demeanor from the fact that the slavery has ripped the family apart, as it did so many thousands of black families in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Well, he comes back to Groton and runs for Congress. He's not successful at first. George's family were teetotalers, and he joins the Temperance Party to begin with. But that gets him absolutely nowhere. You're not going to win elections as part of the Temperance Party. So he changes to Democrat in 1841, wins his first election to the Mass House, and proceeds to serve 7 different terms throughout the 1840s. And that was instrumental also in dealing with the slavery issue at the state level in Massachusetts. But he joins the committees on banking, on transportation, on education, becomes kind of a well-rounded politician during those 7 terms in the Massachusetts House. In his personal life, he marries Sarah Thayer, who's from Hollis, New Hampshire, in 1841. They have a daughter, Georgiana, in 1843, and then a son, Francis, in 1847. So George is building a family, building a political career, building a dry goods store business in Groton, all at the same time in the 1840s. That all leads to certainly one of the most consequential political events in George's life in 1851, when he becomes the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts. Now, George at the time, as I mentioned, was a Democrat, and for good reason, a Democrat. Coming from a farming family, he's in favor of labor issues, of limiting working hours. He's not part of the Boston Brahmin elite or the Whigs of Beacon Hill. He's a good Democrat. But at the national level, Democrats are the pro-slavery party. They're controlled by Southern Democrats. And George increasingly cannot stomach the national Democratic platform in favor of slavery. So in 1851, there's this revolution in politics going on, not only in Massachusetts, but throughout the country, where the Whigs are disintegrating. The Democrats are splitting between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And in a few years, the Republican Party will be born in 1854-55. But in 1851, George enters into a coalition with people like Henry Wilson and Nathaniel Banks, other Massachusetts politicians, which allows him to serve 2 terms as governor until 1853. And this is when he builds his family home, which is pictured on Main Street in Groton. Very nice Italianate structure that he built for his family in 1851, which is today the home of the Groton Historical Society. It is open on select Saturdays and other days of the week, but that's where George's papers and all of the family archives are kept, and where I did much of my research for the book, right there in the Boutwell house on Main Street in Groton. So we've got George now up until 1851, 1853, he's governor. He's kind of hit the ceiling of Massachusetts politics. He's served in the Mass House, he's been governor. What's going to come next? Well, what comes next, as I mentioned, is the birth of the Republican Party. First in Massachusetts with a convention in Worcester, which George is very instrumental in helping to organize and lead. And then 5 years later, the all-important Republican National Convention in Chicago, Illinois, which nominates Abraham Lincoln to be president, and essentially then kind of sets us on the path to civil war, which I'll get to in a moment. But George was a very important senior statesman in the Republican Party in Massachusetts in the 1850s, and then increasingly at the national level. I'd like to point out at the 1860 National Convention in Chicago, George was honored by his fellow delegates with being one of 7 members of the drafting committee for the Republican National platform that elected Lincoln. There were something like 450, 460 delegates. George's drafting skills, which he had demonstrated at a Massachusetts Constitutional Convention several years earlier, were recognized now nationally by his Republican peers, and he helped write the Republican platform that elected Lincoln. Now, that platform contained the extremely important provision that there would be no extension of slavery into the Western territories, that the American government could not meddle with slavery where it existed in the South, because that was protected by the American Constitution, but that Congress had the ability to prevent any extension of slavery into the Western territories which, of course, for many Southern slaveholders was akin to a death knell for slavery. If slavery couldn't expand, it would die. And they said that if Lincoln is elected on that platform, there will be secession, there will be civil war. And George was monumentally responsible for standing up and supporting that provision and saying that slavery has extended this far, it can go no further. So George is getting to meet other Republican notables at the convention and whatnot. One of the great experiences I had in writing this book. After the convention in 1860, in May of 1860, George travels to Springfield, Illinois, with a small group of Republican notables who give Lincoln the official notice of his nomination. And they meet Lincoln in the Lincoln House at 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield. For those who have been, it's just a wonderful experience to go to the Lincoln home. Well, several years ago, I was visiting it again, as I had before, but this time knowing that when I went into that front parlor in Lincoln's home, George Boutwell had stood in that exact same spot in 1860, because that was the first place he ever met Lincoln and shook hands with Abraham Lincoln. So George meets Lincoln for the first time in May of 1860. He gets to know the new president. George is a very important liaison between the Massachusetts government and the federal government once war breaks out. In April of 1861, Governor John Andrew appoints George as the liaison to go to Washington and help speed the delivery of troops and supplies to the national government. So he's getting to know Lincoln even more that way, such that in 1862, as I mentioned, when the all-important Tax Revenue Act was passed and this new Office of Commissioner of Revenue was formed, Lincoln turns to George to fill that position in July of 1862. And it's an incredibly crucial role for the Union. In 1862, it's a dire time for the Union. George McClellan is retreating from the Virginia Peninsula once again. Wounded Union troops are all over Washington, D.C. Union coffers are empty. Lincoln famously says the bottom is out of the tub, which is why they needed to have someone like George create the Office of Revenue to begin appointing tax collectors and assessors all over the North who would raise the crucially needed funds that the Union needed to prosecute the war against the Confederacy. So George is there from July 1862, March of 1863. He starts with 3 staff members on the bottom floor of the Treasury, which is pictured here, reporting for work each day. And by the time he leaves 8 months later, the Revenue Department has thousands of assessors and collectors who, again, are collecting that much needed revenue. And George did it all without scandal. He did it transparently. He would often advertise in the newspapers exactly what taxes needed to be paid, what taxes did not need to be paid, and he tried to be as transparent about it as possible, even with the introduction for the first time in American history of the income tax. Now, it was a wartime measure, and people paid it willingly to support the Union troops. But I still have to tell people that my relative was responsible for introducing the income tax for the first time in American history, and I hope they don't hold that against me. So George is working there until April of 1863, when he goes to the next level of his political career. And that is 14 years he will spend from 1863 to 1877 in Washington, D.C., in arguably one of the most important periods in American history. I would say there is no more important period. You have the Civil War, you have the Lincoln assassination, you have the Johnson impeachment, you have Ulysses Grant being elected, and George was there for it all. He serves in the U.S. House for 6 years. He represents the 7th Massachusetts District in the U.S. House of Representatives, centered on Lowell and that part of the state. And while he's there, he helps, as I've mentioned, lead the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. The cartoon on the lower left is Johnson kind of scowling as a black man goes to try and vote. The person standing behind the black man is kind of the federal government protecting his rights to vote, because Johnson and the Southern white supremacist standing next to him would do everything they can to prevent the black man from voting. Well, George Boutwell leads the impeachment of Johnson. Because of that, he helps enact both the 14th and 15th Amendments, which crucially define birthright citizenship. They define equality under the law. And then the 15th Amendment, of course, gives blacks the right to vote, all in the late 1860s. So a monumentally important 6 years that George is in the U.S. House. He's known as one of the radical Republicans, which was not a term of derision at the time. It was, essentially they were progressives, and that's what radical meant. People like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, Ben Butler, and others, all of whom were seeking to protect black rights in the South against the executive overreach of Andrew Johnson in the presidency. So that's the first 6 years of George's career. He's then appointed by Grant to be Secretary of the Treasury for 4 years. As I mentioned, he introduces some incredibly important economic measures to get the American economy back on track. But also, at the time, the Treasury was the overseer of the U.S. Secret Service. And at the time, the Secret Service had a very important role in infiltrating white supremacist groups in the South and breaking them up and bringing them to prosecution. So George, as the head of the Treasury Department, oversees the Secret Service, so he still has a hand in terms of protecting black rights in the South. He serves 4 years for Grant in 1873. He's appointed by the Mass legislature to fill out an unexpired term in the U.S. Senate and does 4 years in the Senate, where he helps write the 1875 Civil Rights Act. And most importantly, and the thing I really love to emphasize, is this 1876 Mississippi Report. The thing I really try and stress and that I love about George Boutwell is that he stayed the course. George Boutwell did not kind of talk about protecting black rights before the Civil War or during the Civil War, but then fall by the wayside. He was one of the few people who were there from before the Civil War until the end of Reconstruction in 1877, doing what he could to defend equality for all Americans and voting rights for all Americans. And that 1876 Mississippi Report is a good example. Reconstruction started to come to an end in the middle 1870s. Northern publics are getting tired of the federal government going down and trying to protect black rights. They want to get back to the economy. They want to get back to the business of America being business. 1876 is the centenary of America's birth. They're just getting tired of racial issues and they want to get away from them. George Boutwell, will not give it up. 1875 were some crucially important elections in Mississippi, where white Democrats overthrew the lawful Republican state government through fraud, intimidation, and violence. White supremacist groups terrorizing blacks in the middle of the night, and they so-called redeemed their state for white supremacy in 1875. Well, in 1876, George is appointed the chair of a Senate Select Committee to go to Mississippi to report on these outrages and to document what had happened that year. They took testimony in Washington, but they also traveled to Jackson and Aberdeen, Mississippi in June and July of 1876. Very unfriendly country. Some of the newspapers down there were jokingly saying that they hoped George Boutwell didn't get Ku Kluxed while he was there. And they weren't kidding. If given half a chance, there could have been violence. Well, George takes testimony in Mississippi, comes back, helps oversee a 2,000-page report with verbatim testimony and eyewitness first-hand testimony about what had taken place in Mississippi in 1875. It's published in August of 1876, right as Grant is finishing his term, as Reconstruction is ending. George Boutwell stands up on the floor of the Senate, waves the 2,000-page report, and says, here is the documentary evidence of how Southern white Democrats are overthrowing Reconstruction in the South and undermining equality before the law. And almost no one cared. No one listened. They just wanted to be done with it. They wanted to, move on. Even some of the newspapers back in Boston were not terribly complimentary of George continuing to fight the fight for black civil rights in 1876. I love to tell people that this report, the 1876 Mississippi Report, is easily findable on the web. Just Google 1876 Mississippi Report or the Boutwell Report. You'll get all 2,000 pages. You can read it at your leisure. It's not very comforting reading. Blacks and whites talking about the violence that was visited on them by white Democrats in 1875. But the fact is, the documentary evidence is there, and it proves that white Democrats in the South overthrew Reconstruction. They overthrew all that had been done in the 14th and 15th Amendments to protect civil rights in the South, and George Boutwell helped leave that for the historical record. Well, I've talked about his, Massachusetts career, his Washington career. People would then, of course, naturally ask, well, if George Boutwell was so consequential and so important, how come he's not better known? And it's a very fair question. I won't go into it in depth. My book does in the introduction. Two main reasons that I give. One, personality, and this is far less important. George was kind of disdained by the Boston elites, by the Brahmins from Harvard and whatnot. He was just a central Massachusetts farmer. What did he know about running the government? And they just, never gave him much time. More importantly, George was seen by American historians as being on the losing side of history for much of the 20th century. Johnson impeachment, up until recently, was seen as kind of a wild-eyed radical Republican attempt to impeach a president for no good reason. Well, we've had major histories in the past 20 or 30 years that have overturned that interpretation and given much more credit to George Boutwell as one of the leaders of impeachment. Same with the Grant administration. Up until the 1950s, 60s, 70s, Ulysses Grant was seen as one of our very worst presidents. He was a neophyte. He was corrupt. He was naive, too trusting of subordinates and family members, didn't know what he was doing. Well, that was all, spun by people like Henry Adams and other Boston Brahmins who were writing in the early 20th century, totally unfairly. But again, in the last 20 or 25 years, new histories have seen the pluses and the minuses of the Grant administration in much more kind of equitable and favorable light, and ergo have seen George Boutwell's role in a much better light. This is a comical little cartoon here of, at the time in the 1870s, Grant was accused of being the puppet of people who knew more than he did. Here he is, kind of a monkey on a organ grinder, and he's being wound up by George Boutwell, the Secretary of Treasury, and he's just stuffing a jam jar with dollar bills from the Treasury Department. He's the puppet of the White House. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Finally, third losing side of history, the anti-imperialist campaign. Again, new histories of that in the last 20, 25 years give much more credence to the efforts of Twain and Carnegie and Boutwell to oppose the annexation of the Philippines. But of course, what has been as important as anything, is American history and the fact that we had Vietnam in the 50s and 60s, we've had Afghanistan, we've had Iraq. We now know the dangers of nation building, of going overseas and trying through military means to affect political objectives overseas. We tried that in the Philippines. It did not work successfully. We tried it in Vietnam. It was disastrously unsuccessful, and similarly so in Afghanistan and Iraq. So anti-war, anti-imperialist, attitudes on the part of Boutwell and others are seen, much more judiciously today than they were back then. The main reason, of course, that George has suffered for so long was what's known as lost cause. Whoops, sorry, let's go back. The triumph of lost cause historiography. This could take a whole, lecture in itself, but as we know, Southern white historians, Southern white social and cultural arbiters, for many, many years, perpetrated the myth that the South had been wronged by the federal government and by the Union forces, not only during the Civil War, but during Reconstruction, that Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. That if we'd only let the South alone after the Civil War to get on with its social relations, everything would have been fine. There shouldn't have been no federal meddling. Well, that was the dominant myth, the dominant historical narrative for much of the 20th century, and ergo, George Boutwell suffered accordingly. Again, that has changed greatly in the last 30 or 40 years. Eric Foner and others writing new interpretations of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and much more balanced. And here are just some of the new histories that I've been mentioning. David Stewart and Brenda Wineapple on the Johnson impeachment, Ron Chernow, Ronald White, Charles Calhoun, and so many others on the Grant presidency, Stephen Kinzer, Stanley Carnow, Max Boot on anti-imperialism, and then Eric Foner, Nicholas Lehman, Benjamin Quarles, and again, many, many others about Reconstruction. For those who've read widely in these areas, you'll know that the triumph of lost cause historiography has been on the decline for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years because of these new histories using new primary sources and a much clearer eye as to what went on in American history during that period. Well, I want to finish with a couple of kind of Massachusetts connections that I think will interest all of you. And the first one has to do with John F. Kennedy, Massachusetts' favorite native son. 1876, I've mentioned George's Senate report describing the Mississippi elections of 1875. A prominent individual in those elections in 1875, a prominent white Democrat named Lucius Lamar, had a lot to do with undermining black votes, black rights, and undermining Republican rule in Mississippi and restoring white Democrats to power in Mississippi in 1875-76. Well, many years later, 80 years later, JFK writes his Profiles in Courage, 1956. And to my mind, unfortunately, one of the people he includes is a profile in coverage is Lucius Lamar. The reason JFK does that is that Lamar had given a famous eulogy for Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate in 1874, in which Lamar was grandiosely calling for reconciliation between North and South. You know, yes, Charles Sumner was a staunch advocate of Northern rights and black rights and whatnot, but he's died. It's time to bury the hatchet, to reconcile North and South, and to bring the country back together. Well, frankly, Lamar was talking out of both sides of his mouth. When he was in Washington, he had one message for Northerners. When he was back in Mississippi, he had another message for Southern white Democrats, and he was very much an architect of Southern white supremacist rule in the South in the 1800s. Well, to my mind, kind of JFK bought into that in terms of Lamar's eulogy of Charles Sumner. And JFK is also very critical of federal Reconstruction under Ulysses Grant, even going so far as to say that Reconstruction was a black nightmare the South could never forget, sustained and nourished by federal bayonets. Essentially, JFK in Profiles in Courage is taking the line that things would have been better off if the North had just stepped away and let the South take care of its own social relations in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and whatnot. Well, eventually they did, and of course, what did it lead to? It led to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, separate but equal. It led to apartheid between blacks and whites for most of the 20th century, up until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. You know, a very different interpretation of Reconstruction given by JFK. What I love to finish with, of course, is that in 1956, JFK is criticizing federal intervention in the South, that it should not be sustained and nourished by federal bayonets. What does he do as president 6 years later? When the University of Mississippi refuses to admit a black student, JFK sends federal marshals and troops to Ole Miss to make sure they admit James Meredith. As president, he does exactly the same thing in 1962 that he criticized Grant and others for in Profiles in Courage in 1956. It just so shows how history is not static, attitudes change, people grow, and you know, we should never be looking at one snapshot in time in terms of what's going on. So that's my kind of story of George Boutwell's, and this is a copy of his Select Committee report of 1875, JFK's Profiles in Courage, all leading to 1962 when JFK uses federal bayonets to admit James Meredith to Ole Miss. The other nice local connection I like to make is a Lincoln eulogy in Lowell, Mass. On April 19th, 1865, given by George Boutwell. George was, as I said, a confidant, close friend of Lincoln, but he had left Washington in April at the end of the Civil War after Lee has surrendered at Appomattox. He's come back to Groton to be with his family, and he's in Groton on April 14th when Lincoln is shot at Ford's Theater. Lincoln then dies, of course, the next morning on April 15th. But George is home when Lincoln is assassinated. He gets the news, he's devastated, and he's asked to give a eulogy to Lincoln in Lowell, Mass. On the 19th of April, 1865. Well, this memorial that I show is a memorial that George would have passed as he got off the train station in Lowell and marched over to Huntington Hall to give his eulogy for Lincoln. This is a memorial to Luther Ladd, Addison Whitney, and those men of the 6th Massachusetts Regiment who had died in Baltimore en route to D.C. on April 19, 1861. They were the first casualties of the Civil War. Massachusetts troops who have responded to Lincoln's call for troops. Mobs in Baltimore riot, they stone and kill these soldiers of the 6th Mass Regiment for whom this memorial is erected. And I just love to think of George walking by that memorial on the way to giving a very heartfelt eulogy to Abraham Lincoln. But of course, the irony of all of this happening on April 19th, the fact that George gives a speech on April 19th, the fact that the 4 soldiers had died on April 19th in 1861, and of course, April 19th, 1775, one of the most important dates in Massachusetts and national history, being Lexington and Concord and the start of the Revolutionary War. To think that April 19th would play such a prominent role both in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and finally with George Boutwell giving a eulogy to Abraham Lincoln in Lowell, Massachusetts. So that's my presentation on George. Happy to answer questions about, again, why I think he's significant, but especially if you have questions as to, well, if he is, how come we haven't heard from him or heard of him for so long? And why is he coming back to life now? Why is he, being resurrected now? I'll be happy to share my story as a family member and how I came to write about George. But with that, I'll turn it back to Robert.
So, folks, let's give Jeffrey a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. And as Jeffrey said, we'll take about 15 minutes of questions here. And Jeffrey, you anticipated a couple of the questions. Teresa wants to know, are you a direct descendant of George Boutwell? And Jeff asks, how are you related to George? Do you resemble him or share any of his personality traits?
Good questions both. No, I'm not a direct descendant. George actually has no direct descendants. I mentioned the 2 children he had, Georgiana, his daughter, Francis, his son. Neither one of them had children. So the line stopped there in Groton. I do want to give a shout out to Georgiana Boutwell, who's a fascinating character in her own right. Those who've read the book or do read the book have lots of material in there about Georgie, what a fascinating character she was. But we all owe her an incredible debt of gratitude because George Boutwell dies in 1905. Georgiana lives in the Boutwell House in Groton until 1933. When she dies, she gives it to the Groton Historical Society. And the fact that she did is the only reason that the family papers and archives have been preserved now for, the 100 years since then, and why they were available to me when I went to do my research. My relationship to George is that we have a common ancestor, Boutwell farming families going back to the 17 and 1600s, and really all the way back to 1632, when James Boutwell emigrated from England as an indentured servant, ended up in Salem, Mass., worked out his indentured servitude in 6 years, and then went on to propagate several lines of New England Boutwell farming families.
Jeffrey, I think folks right now are seeing us in small boxes and they're seeing a big black screen because your presentation ended. Would you mind stop sharing your screen? There,
Right there.
that's we want to
Yeah,
see you, Jeffrey. There it is.
very
Perfect.
good.
All right. So, and again, you anticipated some of the other questions. So, Ralph wants to know yes, why is he not taught more in history? Why is he not discussed more amongst historians?
That is changing. And again, because historians ignored or dismissed, not just ignored, but dismissed George, because Southern historians, didn't want anything to do with radical Republicans like George Boutwell or Thaddeus Stevens or even Charles Sumner. So he was both, dismissed and ignored by historians for many years. It's been very gratifying that while working on the book, new histories are coming out. They mention George much more prominently. It should be said and admitted that because of his personality, he was not an outsized personality. He was not a great orator like Charles Sumner. He wasn't a larger life figure like Thaddeus Stevens. George kind of kept his nose to the grindstone. He did his job. He was not an attention seeker. And for that reason, did not have a prominent place in history books. But he is certainly becoming much better known among American historians, among the educated American reading public, and I think his reputation will only grow.
All right. Tanya asked a similar question, so I'm going to skip that one, Tanya. Barbara asks, do you know what George's position was on women's suffrage?
One of his moral failings, one of his blind spots. George did not come out in favor of women's suffrage until very late in life. I've always found that surprising as a progressive in the 1840s and 50s and 60s in favor of black suffrage, in favor of equality, in favor of labor issues. Uh, George was a kind of a hidebound male of the 1800s. When asked why he didn't support women's suffrage, he had this, to me, very lame answer. Well, because the man is considered the head of the household. The man is the head of the family. And in American society, it's the man who pays the taxes. It's the man who votes. And for that reason, women should, not allowed to have the vote. He was certainly in favor of female education. He helped found the Salem Normal School in Salem, Massachusetts in the late 1850s. Georgie was a very well-educated young woman, and so George was in favor of women kind of getting into the teaching profession and having, certain professions themselves. But again, until late in life, he was not in favor of women's suffrage.
So Jeff asks, this is kind of a fun question. What actor would you cast to portray George in a biopic?
Mm. Um, I was thinking about that recently because I do get asked that. Um, let's see, George was about 5'8", 5'9", black hair, jet black hair, black beard, kind of a thin frame, wiry, always in good shape. He was in great health almost his entire life, but not a large man. Um, oh,
Well, if anyone has any suggestions, let us
please,
know in the chat.
please send them. Yeah.
All right. I think someone just I think what this person is saying is Mandy Patinkin. I might be mispronouncing his last name.
Not a bad idea. Not a bad idea. Mandy could certainly do a good job.
Yeah,
Nice suggestion. Yeah.
yeah. I know him from Homeland, but I know he's more famous for other things as well.
Yeah.
And let's see. Jeff says Colin Farrell. JM says Hugh Jackman, maybe.
Hugh Jackman. Yep. Yep.
There we go. So
You would want
Jeffrey,
someone who's not overly demonstrative, but who's passionate about the issues that he believes in.
so an anonymous attendee wants to know how does Massachusetts honor George Boutwell?
It's been gratifying. As I was doing my research, I went to the Mass State Library and Archives. I met Beth, who at the time was at the library. I met Susan in charge of the archive office. Uh, and there is a portrait of George, a governor's portrait in the State House on Governor's Wall. You walk around the State House, and George is right there, 1851 to 53. But also, Susan took me to the basement. There was a bust of George Boutwell that's been kind of hidden under plastic in the basement of the Mass State House for a long time. And it was nice when I gave my talk at the Mass State House Library back in March, I think it is. She arranged to have it brought up to the library, and it was there while I was giving my talk. So, at least in that respect, he is, acknowledged. Beyond that, I have to admit, not much. I'm not sure Massachusetts teachers teach him that often. I will give a shout out here to a new friend of mine, Haley, who's a history teacher from Lunenburg, who listened to one of my talks and got in touch. She and I have been in touch since then. She wants to teach about George in her Lunenburg History High School class. And I'm delighted to say that on the 29th of September, I'll be giving a talk in Lunenburg to the Lunenburg Historical Society. And Haley is going to bring her high school class to that talk. So I'll be able to talk to high school students about how George is kind of a black hole in Massachusetts and American history.
So I am in the chat putting a link to all of Jeffrey's upcoming events. So Jeffrey's in Maryland,
Oh,
but
can I? Oh,
yes, go ahead, Jeffrey.
superb. Whoever said this, you get 3 gold stars because that's the name I was trying to think of. David Straight-Heron. David Straight-Heron would be a perfect George Boutwell. Same physique, same demeanor. And I was trying, Good Night and Good Luck, that great movie with David Straight-Heron. But whoever put that in the chat room, you've nailed it.
Excellent. All right, jumping back to the Q&A. Let's see. Do you know, has George ever been on a postage stamp?
No, no.
Yep. So Janice wants to know, did George have any sort of relationship with Longfellow?
A contentious one, in the sense that in the late 1840s and 1850s, George is becoming increasingly anti-slavery, but especially when he's governor in 1851 to 53. He's circumscribed by Massachusetts law and by the political office. He can only do so much about slavery because slavery is primarily a national issue. And there were some famous cases of Anthony Burns and other escaped slaves being captured in Boston, being manacled and sent back down to Virginia. And George is kind of powerless to stop that. President Pierce, had sent federal troops to bring this person back to Virginia or Georgia. And George took a lot of criticism from people like Longfellow and others for not doing more to prevent national policy of returning escaped slaves back to the South. But in this case, he really was powerless to do so.
Alyssa writes, any connection to Edward Dickinson or to Amherst College?
Not that I know of.
That's all right. That's a good answer, Jeffrey.
Okay.
Jane wants to know, how does Groton honor George Boutwell?
Groton deserves incredible credit for keeping his legacy alive even before 1933. The Groton Historical Society was founded in the 1890s by George Boutwell and other prominent citizens. So it was very active from the 1890s into the 20th century. But then when George E. dies in 1933, the Groton Historical Society takes over the house. It's very expensive, obviously, to maintain a residence like that, but they've kept it up. They've done the fundraising. They've preserved the papers there. And there were open houses in the Boutwell House. There are various other things around town. The Boutwell Early Education Center in Groton, I gather from Robert. There are other Boutwell Early Education centers around Massachusetts. And let me just very briefly mention that education was a passion of George Boutwell's. For 5 years, he was the chairman of the Massachusetts Board of Education in the 1850s. He traveled to 300 Massachusetts towns and cities talking about public education. He was a great, great advocate for public education at a time when it was not widely available to all. He followed in the footsteps of Horace Mann, the famous first chair of that mass board. And George just was, again, he had many passions in life, but public education was one of them.
So, Jeffrey, we're winding things down. We'll take a few more questions. Jane wants to know, when did you become aware of George's importance?
Um, it's a great question, and I really should, it deserves to be folded into the talk. I grew up in the Boston area. My family never mentioned George Boutwell. I had no idea we had an illustrious relative like that until I got into my 20s and 30s. I was a real history buff, so I'm reading American history, and occasionally I come across the name of George Boutwell, but my family never mentioned him. I had to learn about him on my own as I get older and older in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Eventually, I'm coming across histories of Reconstruction and the Civil War that prominently mention George and the role he played. And so I'm thinking, there's something here that deserves further study. George, at the end of his life, wrote a 2-volume memoir, Reminiscence of 60 Years in Public Life. And I read through that. Even more significantly, he's got a wonderful volume of speeches he gave before, during, and after the Civil War about Black rights. Some of the most stirring speeches you'll ever want to read about the need for equality in American life. So the more I delved into it, the more I realized that this guy was a multifaceted individual who really had been neglected by so many people. And what an honor as a family member to be able to be really the first one to write a modern biography about him. And thank God I had all of those papers in Groton, personal letters to Grant and Lincoln and family memorabilia and this, that, and the other thing that really allowed me to flesh out George's story.
Well, and along those lines, an anonymous attendee asks, how long did it take you to research and write the book?
Started in March 2020, right at the beginning of COVID. I had some other projects at the time that were interrupted by COVID. So I thought, well, now or never, it's time to put up or shut up. So thanks to the wonders of digital technology, I was able to do much of my research online. Gradually, as things opened up, I would go to the Lincoln Presidential Library in Illinois. I'd go to the Grant Presidential Library in Mississippi. I'd go to the Library of Congress in Washington. But I was able to do a lot of the research online and essentially spent 4 years doing it. March 2020 to March of 2024. Then the book was published in January of 25.
Have you ever presented, this is from Jean, or maybe Jeannie, I think it's Jean. Have you ever presented at the Mass Historical Society, and do you know if they have any archives on George?
They do. They have some, scattered letters and whatnot of George, but that are in other collections, things like the Charles Sumner collection and whatnot. I've given talks at the Boston Athenaeum, American Ancestors, the Mass State Library, and happy to say that I'll be giving a talk at the Mass Historical Society next April as part of their series on the writing of biography. So I do have something at the Mass Historical Society coming up next spring.
Final question is going to go to Thomas, who writes, what do you feel motivates people like George Boutwell to not sit back and let things be, but instead go through efforts not necessarily beneficial to themselves to devote themselves to an enormously unpopular, if righteous, cause?
It's the $64,000 question. I wish we had more people like that who would stay the course, who would not give up when the going gets tough. George was just self-motivated. I think as much as anything, he was just so intellectually curious. He wanted to keep learning. He wanted to keep pushing the boundaries, whether it's constitutional law, international law, economics and finance, whatever. He really was just a striver, and he would not give up and not say no.
Yeah. So, Jeffrey, we're going to wrap it there. Any last words for the audience?
Just thank you very much for attending. And again, it's such a joy to be able to talk about a central Massachusetts native son like George Boutwell, who spent his formative years in Lunenburg, then in Groton. That's the area he came from. Those are the values that helped inform him. I always love when I'm able to come back to that area. I'll be in Groton again in September. I'll be in Lunenburg. But really, it's a special, special place that I hope will recognize what a special native son they have.
And, feel free to purchase a copy of Jeffrey's book, available wherever books are sold, and also maybe borrow it from your local library. So, folks, we'll give Jeffrey one more big virtual round of applause. Look for an email from me in about 45 minutes with a link to the recording and information about some other upcoming virtual programs. And please take the feedback survey when you exit the Zoom. So thank you
And
all.
Robert,
Yes,
Robert, I just want to say, please do include my email in that the email you send out to people. And by all means, folks, get in touch if you have questions. Love to hear from you.
Excellent. Yep. In that email, I will include Jeffrey's contact info and his website. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again, Jeffrey.
Thank you, everybody. Really enjoyed it.